Good morning if you are in the West Coast like me and one of our discussants, Elyse Semerdjian. Good afternoon if you are in the East Coast, and good evening if you are like our speaker, Marc Baer, and one of our other discussants, Ceyda Karamürsel, in London or further east. Welcome to another session of What's Up, our monthly meetings organized by the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association and brought to you with the technical help from the University of California at Davis. Today, as you all know, when you signed up, we are going to talk about Marc's recently published book, The Ottomans, Khans, Caesars, Caliphs. And I'm going to introduce Marc at least in a minute. But before I introduce them, I'd like to just tell you a bit about what is up next month. So next month in February, we have a WhatsApp meeting. You'll see that in the next slide, but we also have meetings of our other series, which are occasional, which are not every month, but every once in a while when there is something to pick up, we try to pick that up. And so in Turkey now, we will host Mehmet Deniz, a recent PhD from SUNY Binghamton in sociology. And he'll talk about his dissertation. The dissertation was found because of its topic and its content, not worthy of a equivalence in Turkey by the Inter-University Board of Turkey, and as a result, Mehmet Deniz's PhD is not recognized in Turkey. He'll share with us his dissertation, summarize it, and Cihan Tual, a colleague at the University of California in Berkeley, who's a professor of sociology, will be our discussant. And in OTSA Co-op, we will talk about writing a short history of the Ottoman Empire, a textbook for Ottoman history that was recently published by University of Toronto Press. The author, Rene Worringer, will give us a sort of a short presentation about challenges about writing for the classroom, English-speaking classroom. And then we'll have three colleagues who taught this book in the fall quarter, in the fall semester, Evren Altınkaş, Janet Klein, and Mustafa Minavi, telling us about their experiences in the classroom. And what our WhatsApp session will be on Ottoman religious politics in the confessional age, chaired by Tiana Kristic and Derin Terzioğlu, and featuring members of their team, Auto Confession, that's been working on since 2015 and published a book already, or another one is coming, etc. You'll hear about all of them. So I announced these in my monthly message, and then there will be also social media posts soon up for you to register. Now, today I am very, very privileged to introduce to you someone who probably doesn't need introduction. If you study Ottoman history, whichever period you study, you probably have come across to something Marc wrote. He wrote more books than most people I know in our field. I'm not going to say he is the most published book author of our field because I didn't do statistics, but he is very likely the one. His first book, he teaches at London School of Economics, so he's joining us from London, and his first book, Honored by the Glory of Islam, Conversion and Conquest in Ottoman Europe, is well known for those of us who study the 17th century, like myself. Then he moved to a topic that actually extends in time from the 17th century all the way to the 20th. The Dönme, Jewish Converts, Muslim Revolutionaries, and Secular Turks was his second book. In his third book, he focused on a character that is, to me, was not known, and I'm very happy to get to know him thanks to Marc, German, Jew, Muslim, gay, The Life and Times of Hugo Marcus was his third book. And then more recently, he published Sultanic Saviors and Tolerant Turks Writing Ottoman Jewish History, Denying the Armenian Genocide. And this book was the winner last year of Dr. Sona Aronian Book for Excellence in Armenian Studies for a book published in 2020. Then that is by the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research in the United States. The book that he will introduce to us today is the one called The Ottomans, Khans, Caesars, and Caliphs. And if you follow the Ottoman History podcast, there was an interview with Marc already. The second part of that interview will be released this Friday. Then I'll introduce to you my colleague Elyse, who will be going first in commenting on the book. We sort of thought about it chronologically. Elyse Semerdjian teaches at Whitman College. She's a professor of history there, and also she is the president of the Syrian Studies Association. And those of you who study gender in Ottoman history would be very familiar with her book, Off the Straight Path, Illicit Sex, Law, and Community in Ottoman Aleppo. I believe she is working on a second book, but maybe she'll tell about that herself, or maybe we'll host her at a future meeting when we'll talk about that one. And our second discussant is Ceyda Karamürsel. She joins us from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, also, like Marc. She is a lecturer there in the Department of History. She works on slavery, among other things, and she is working on a book manuscript entitled The Sack and the Bowstring, A Global History of Ottoman Slavery and Freedom. I thank all of our participants, of course, Marc and Ceyda and Elyse for making time today. Marc will go first, Elyse next, and then Ceyda. Marc, please go ahead.
Thank you, Baki. Thank you for organizing this event. So I'll talk about one of the themes in my book briefly. My book demonstrates that the Ottoman Empire is not, as it's usually perceived in historiography, especially in European historiography, as unrelated to Europe. The Ottomans ruled over an empire that was, of course, Afro-Asiatic and European. It was a European empire that remains an integral part of European culture and history. And by this, I do not mean that the Ottomans are part of European history because they occupied Europeans' territory and minds. Sorry, can everyone see me? Yeah, sorry. Yeah, good. Okay, sorry. It's not only because of the fear and distrust, the curiosity and admiration that was caused. My book is not a book about the place of the Ottomans in European political thought. This is a book that asks the reader to look at Europe, both as an idea and as a geography as a whole, to conceptualize a Europe that is not merely Christian. So imagine, if you will, a Europe that is Europe, whether it is ruled by Christians or by Muslims. Imagine that the boundary of Europe did not end at the walls of Vienna, the edge of the Holy Roman Empire and the seat of two failed Ottoman sieges. How then might we define Europe, and who might we include as rightfully belonging to it? Now, it's conventional to interpret the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople as a severing of the eastern lands of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, from Europe. But does European territory cease belonging to Europe when it is ruled by Muslims? There's a lot of people who say it does. According to the Ottomans, their advance into Europe meant that they were the inheritors of Byzantium, were thus to be considered the new Romans. These Muslim rulers of Europe saw themselves as the rightful inheritors of Rome, and not by virtue of the incorporation of territory alone, but because of their vision of building a universal empire. The Ottomans have been referred to as Europe's Muslim emperors and caliphs as often as they've been seen as the Middle East Caesars and the Romans of the Muslim world. Why not refer to them simply as Romans? Arabs, Persians, Indians, and Turks referred to the Ottoman rulers as Caesars and their dominion as the Roman Empire. And beginning with the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople, some Western European writers did so too. Some posited that the Ottomans were descendants of the Trojans. Others worried about the legitimacy of Ottoman claims to the inheritance of Roman rights. One 16th century papal advisor noted that the Sultan often says that the Empire of Rome and of the whole of the West belongs to him by right, as he is the legitimate successor of the Emperor Constantine, who transferred the empire to Constantinople. Why have we forgotten what Europeans thought 500 years ago? And of course, here I am, I wrote this book at a time when my new country, the UK, left Europe. These are the questions in people's minds here. In fact, the Ottomans have been treated as poorly as the Byzantines. Both the Ottoman Empire and the Byzantine Empire were long-lasting centralized empires that to this day stand outside the standard Western narratives about the formation of Europe. Both are held up to later Western European benchmarks of development and history, such as the Renaissance and Reformation, and found lacking. Think of what comes to mind when we use the term Byzantine today: medieval, backward, Oriental, exotic, religiously distinct, and unfathomable due to the hurdle of language. Because the religiosity of both empires has been overemphasized, their secular aspects are less often investigated. At a certain point in both their histories, they've been portrayed as decadent, corrupt, and in a state of irrevocable decline. Both the Byzantines and the Ottomans have been depicted predominantly in the negative as the antithesis of the West. But when we consider how these empires thought of themselves, we realize how false these views are. Both empires saw themselves as the heirs to Rome and claimed Europeanness. The Ottomans called their Southeastern European provinces, as the audience knows, Rumeli, the land of the Romans. Rum, of course, was the Turkish way of saying Rome, the core territory of the Byzantine Empire in the Balkans and Western Anatolia. This view of the Ottomans as insiders raises the question of who owns or inherits an empire, who a continent. What do we count or discount as historical continuity? Who bears historical responsibility for what? What happens when both history and responsibility are shared? Why should Turkey have the only claim to Ottoman history? The histories of the Byzantines and the Ottomans are subject to the nationalist and religious agendas of their modern-day counterparts, the Byzantines to the Greeks, the Ottomans to the Turks. Today, these agendas are tied to visions of restoring history formerly belonging to their empire, such as when Turkish neo-Ottomanism glorifies former conquests and denies former atrocities. History is used for political ends whenever Greek donors, such as in the United States, endow university chairs in ancient Byzantine and modern Hellenic or Greek studies that ignore that the Ottomans ruled what is today Greece for over 500 years. Or when the Turkish Republic endows chairs in Ottoman studies that gloss over the significant inheritance of the Byzantine and Greek peoples, institutions, and attitudes. The way we remember the past would look quite different if we instead referred to both the Byzantines and the Ottomans as Romans, which is how they viewed themselves. Acknowledging the Ottoman dynasty as part of European history allows us to see that the Ottomans were not separate from the Roman Empire and did not seek to be, but rather claimed to inherit universal rule over that former empire. They did not evolve in parallel with Europe. Their story is the unacknowledged part of the story the West tells about itself. The Ottomans actually partook in many aspects of European religious and political developments long attributed to Western Europeans alone. Recognition of the shared history of dynasties and societies in the whole of Europe emerges when we focus on the Eurasian Empire of the Ottomans. Rather than being an attempt to prove that the Ottomans measure up to Eurocentric standards, acknowledging their role in European history causes us to expand the meaning of that history and to rewrite its basic concepts and frameworks. Things such as the Renaissance, the Age of Discovery, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the Scientific Revolution, as well as the meaning of millenarianism and messianism, sexuality and pleasure, absolutism and limited government, slavery and Orientalism, and world war. Viewing the history of the Ottomans as part and parcel of European history allows us to understand the origins and meanings of concepts and practices, such as religious tolerance, secularism, modernity, and even genocide in a different light. We recognize that they began with Muslim Europeans. The conventional claim of European history that Europeans first had to figure out how to live with people of different religions only in the 16th century, due exclusively to the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, begins to seem improbable. In that story, only then was the concept of tolerance first debated and became a reality of daily life. Tolerance, modernity, and secularism emerged for the first time, we are told, in Western Europe only after the wars of religion that raged roughly from 1550 to 1650. The first concrete steps were supposedly taken with the signing of the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, a series of treaties that instituted the principle of tolerance of religious minorities. From 1650 to 1700, Europe entered what is celebrated as the Enlightenment, symbolized by John Locke's seminal essay of 1689, A Letter Concerning Toleration, which opened the way toward a live and let live approach to religious difference and the secular modern age. With more and more intellectuals promoting tolerance, some enlightened European rulers began to institute it in the 18th century. But the historical record demonstrates that the principles and practices of toleration had already been established at the onset of Ottoman rule in southeastern Europe in the 14th century, a fact made especially visible in Constantinople after the Ottoman conquest of that Byzantine city. Ottoman religious tolerance was based upon Islamic precedent already introduced to Europe in 8th century Muslim Spain, and upon nomadic pre-Islamic Mongol antecedents from the Eurasian steppe, that crossroads of Europe and Asia, out of which the Ottomans grew. While full toleration did not exist in medieval Christian Europe, it did exist in medieval Islamic Europe, including in Ottoman domains. Ottoman tolerance is European tolerance. Why then aren't the Ottomans conventionally included in the history of religious tolerance in Europe? By the time Western Europeans first encountered questions about how to live together, the Ottomans had already figured out the answers to them. These included what rights and privileges each religious group would have, where different groups would worship, how they would pay for the upkeep of the religious community, its house of worship and schools, how charity would be raised and distributed, whether people from different groups could intermarry, where they could live, how they could interact socially and economically, how festivals would be celebrated in public, and how each religious group would be governed and its relation to the government. In the view of mid-17th century English writer, Ottoman toleration of many religions was preferable to the violent enforcing of one as occurred in Christian Europe. Religious civil wars and persecution of those with dissenting beliefs actually continued in Catholic and Protestant majority areas of Europe into the 18th century. While Christian Europeans have laid claim to originating the institutions of secularism in the 17th century, the Ottomans had for centuries been subordinated religious authority to imperial authority and had made secular law equivalent in force to religious law, surpassing any other European or Islamic polity in this regard. They even institutionalized practices that clearly violated Islamic law and custom in favor of secular law. Why is this not part of the story we tell about when modernity and secularism began, when Ottoman chroniclers justify such practices by saying practicality allows one to do what is illegal? Although the Ottoman Empire embraced tolerance, religious conversion was vital to its success. The Ottoman dynasty emphasized religious change beginning at the top. In Ottoman Turkish, the only term for conversion denote conversion, the only terms denote conversion to Islam. Conversion can only go in one direction. There is no term other than apostasy for when a Muslim becomes a Christian or a Jew. One cannot say a Muslim converted to Christianity. Accordingly, apostates were executed. Tolerance is not the same as celebrating diversity, coexistence, equality, multiculturalism, or mutual acceptance. To tolerate means to suffer, to endure, or to put up with something objectionable. The tolerating party considers its own religion to be true, and the tolerated group's religious claims to be false. That's precisely what we see in Islamic law court records, where Islam is referred to as the right religion, and Christianity and Judaism are referred to as false religions. John Locke famously refused to include Catholics in his conception of tolerance. Tolerance is in fact the expression of a power relationship. Its presence or absence can be wielded as a warning or a threat against a vulnerable group. Tolerance is a state of inequality where the powerful party, such as the ruler, determines whether a less powerful group may exist and to what extent members of that group may be allowed to express their differences. A ruler or regime may discriminate against a group while at the same time tolerating its members being different than the members of the ruling elite. This was how Ottoman tolerance functioned in terms of class, gender, and religious difference. In the Ottoman Empire, certain groups, women, Christians and Jews, slaves, were legally subordinate to others, men, Muslims, the free. All religions were not deemed equally valid. Some groups were proscribed, such as Shiites and dissident Muslim groups. Ottoman society was plural, and individuals could at times change groups or positions of power. Yet each group had a fixed place within the hierarchy based on class, gender, and religion. In practice, tolerance of diversity meant creating an empire that was built on the maintenance of difference. The Ottomans did not seek to make all subjects into Muslims or even into Ottomans, the members of the ruling elite. Rather, they fostered institutions such as the patriarchates, the spiritual offices and jurisdictions of the Armenian and Greek church leaders that allowed Christians and Jews to go about their personal lives, enjoying cultural, religious, and linguistic rights without much interference or limitation. Yet at the same time, religious conversion was used as a means of integration into the empire's highly stratified social fabric. The empire recruited its elite from the cream of the crop of conquered peoples, especially their youth and women, thereby ensuring the dynasty's greatness and the subject people's subordination. Conquered Christian and Muslim royalty, military and religious leaders and commoners were all incorporated into the imperial project from the beginning. The Ottoman dynasty intermarried with European royal houses, including the Byzantine and the Serbian, yet another reason to include this Muslim imperial family within European history. As cruel, unjust, and violent as it was, especially for women, slavery allowed individuals to be incorporated into the elite level of society when women joined the harem and boys were inducted into the administration and military. Christians were made into members of the Ottoman ruling elite through cooperation, subordination, or conversion. Like other empires in history, the Ottomans oversaw large-scale demographic change through conversion of the ruled population. What are today the countries of Bosnia, Bulgaria, Greece, Hungary, Serbia, and Turkey underwent massive religious conversion in the Ottoman centuries. Christians, and to a lesser extent Jews, became Muslims, and the landscape was Islamized to a great extent. The most important churches replaced by mosques, seminaries by madrasas, convents by Sufi lodges. Although such regimes as the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt relied on converted slave soldiers, from whose ranks arose the Sultan, the Ottoman Empire relied mainly on converts to make up key elements of its ruling family, dynasty, administration, and military, converting massive numbers of people in the process over its first 3 centuries. It defined membership in essential ranks of the elite class by religious conversion and continually changed its interpretation of the religion. As the astute 17th century English observer Sir Paul Racot noted, no people in the world have ever been more open to receive all sorts of nations to them than they. And the English call it naturalization, and the Turks, the Ottomans, call it becoming a believer. It truly was an empire of conversion, fostering extensive population change while tolerating the existence of religious groups at variance with the ruler's religion nearly until its tragic end. But tolerance and intolerance were not opposites. Tolerance, discrimination, and persecution always went together. At the same time that social and legal hierarchies preserved the peace for centuries, discrimination and division were a fact of daily life and opportunities. For centuries, the Ottomans were open to receiving every type of person as a Muslim, whatever his or her language or background, whether a slave, a commoner, or a member of the elite. But then, in later years, the Ottomans turned away from incorporating diversity and tried to save the empire by remaking it first into an Ottoman Muslim polity and later a more Turkish one. The consequence was that tolerance, such as it was replaced by ethnic cleansing and genocide, leading ultimately to the dynasty's demise. In the late 19th century, a group of intellectuals in the Ottoman Empire merged European Enlightenment thought and Islam, resulting in compelling experiments with constitutionalism and parliamentary democracy. These efforts failed, however, leading to mass bloodshed, including massacres of tens of thousands of Armenians in the 1890s and in 1909, and the Armenian Genocide of 1915. Along with earlier Ottoman religious toleration, why isn't this genocide considered a part of European history? The fact that German generals and soldiers assisted the Ottomans in committing mass murder during the First World War does make it part of European history. But more important, accepting the Ottomans as a European empire allows us to recognize the Armenian Genocide as the first genocide committed by a European empire in Europe, one that began in Istanbul. Viewing the Ottomans as part of European history does not mean the Ottoman contribution was always positive. The story of the Ottoman dynasty and its empire that I tell in my new book, The Ottomans, seeks neither to glorify the House of Osman, as so many of our colleagues do, nor to condemn it, but to present all that makes it both different and surprisingly familiar for the reader. So thank you. I just wanted to present one of the main arguments of the book. And now I'm delighted to hear from the two commentators.
Marc, thank you so much. And thank you especially for keeping it in good time. I have one announcement to make that came to me from chat, and it is before Elyse. 1 second, it's just because it's housekeeping kind of thing. Nabil Tikriti, he lets us know, would like to remind us, he had already put this up on H-Turk, Middle Atlantic Ottomanists Workshop Conference. The abstracts are due January 31st, and Nabil will share the link on chat just in a minute. Nabil, thank you for reminding me of that. All right, now Elyse, please go ahead.
Thank you. And Baki, referring back to I have relinquished the presidency of the Syrian Studies Association. As a Syrian, I'm always uncomfortable overstaying my welcome when I'm in any kind of presidency. I don't want to repeat the mistakes of the current day. Thank you. And thank you for having me here. It's really an honor to celebrate Marc's book, The Ottomans, Khans, Caesars, and Caliphs, with you all this morning. It's worth noting that this very heavy tome came on the heels of yet another provocative work of history, Sultanic Saviors and Tolerant Turks, both published during a pandemic. I'm trying to not feel inadequate here, but they're both impressive, and I think they're going to have us talking for quite a while due to his provocations. In 2.5 decades of academic publishing, The Ottomans is what we could call Marc's crossover album. It's a smartly written work of history for a general audience, but within it, Marc offers numerous provocations that will keep us, the professionals, talking for some time. He introduces his study by suggesting that the Ottoman Empire should be studied as part of European history, as he's introduced the gesture towards globalizing the Ottomans, who considered themselves a global power fashioned after the Romans, urges us to take an integrative history approach. The title seems to promise a great man history to its audience, likely what most general audiences are craving, if my 18-year-old undergraduates are any indication. They are actually bringing their military history text to class, and I'm disappointing them greatly. But it's troubled actually by Marc's strategic integration of social history as a counterweight, as I see it. Using Orhan Pamuk's White Castle as a muse, Marc suggests out of the gate that the Ottomans are part of European history. He says the Ottomans, this is a quote, "The Ottomans are not part of European history because they occupied Europeans' territories and minds." This is a book that asks the reader to look at Europe, both as an idea and a geography, and as a whole, to conceptualize a Europe that is not merely Christian, unquote. He convincingly portrays a cross-pollination of ideas between the two continents that the Ottomans themselves straddled, and how the Ottomans claimed traditions that are understood to be European as their own. Another thread that's introduced is the idea of Muslim models of tolerance, and he's already explained this quite well. I appreciated his gestures back to Andalusia, the Muslims of Europe, as an antecedent to the Ottomans and to the Enlightenment. Here, Marc is likely preaching to the choir of Ottomanists, but my question is, are there any indications that European historians are receptive to these global decolonizing gestures that the Ottomans makes? Are they ready to let go of centuries of Oriental discourse about the Orientalist discourse about the Ottomans? And where do we and the European historians need to go next, in your view? And throughout the book, Marc pauses to bring Ottoman history into conversation with Europe by drawing upon moments in which the self-fashioning of sultans as the new Romans, it seems that every empire did this. I recently learned that even the Chinese were calling themselves, in some cases, Romans. The examples that Marc plumbs include vivid comparisons of Henry VIII dressing as an Ottoman sultan, Queen Elizabeth's famous rainbow portrait that makes her look like an Ottoman sultana. He spends time analyzing Sultan Suleiman I's Venetian crown, and of course, the famous Bellini portrait of Mehmed II, representing the conversion from Eurasian nomad into a Renaissance prince for a man who called himself Caesar and modeled his own burial after Alexander the Great. Artfully planted examples really root the claims of the introduction throughout the book, making the argument that the Ottomans are part of European history compelling. So in more ways than one, this book is offering what I call good medicine. It's a balm, if you will, for a field that has been actively working to decolonize itself, perhaps because it was constituted through Orientalism. And we could think of what is happening in this text as a kind of diversity work in Ottoman studies, but what it's really doing is bringing fruition the works of and decades of scholarship in social history, whereby historians have been striving to write a history from below that would embed the lived experience of everyday Ottoman subjects into the historical record. And so in this way, Marc is offering us a model for where we can go next with what we might call integrative history. Now, I am borrowing this term from Chinese philologist Joseph Fletcher, who invited scholars to look for parallel patterns of historical change across Eurasia. But as I see it, it's not just the integration continentally here of the Ottomans into Europe. It's also the integration of subfields of Ottoman history into a public-facing grand narrative of the Ottomans. So it's important, in fact, ideal that a person with Marc's expertise is working on, who has worked on the Ottoman history from the margins, writing about Jews and Dönme and women into Ottoman history as he has for the last 2.5 decades, that he's now taken that expertise into writing a public-facing history. In public in the sense that, unlike the rest of us, he gets book reviews in The Guardian and the Wall Street Journal. But the book intends to attract the public to the field of history without compromising the actual history. And unfortunately, as I said, with the 18-year-olds who take my Ottoman history class, it's still the case that they want the stories of the sultans and the caliphs, and they want the stories of military history. And so how do we get them engaged with social history is really still an important work that we need to do. So here's how I see it. The Sultan, Caesar, and Khans are really the gateway drug to the social history, as Marc has crafted it here. We get the juicy morsels, we get the dead sultans who continued to rule for 41 days after they were dead. We get stacked skulls and battles and naked Sufis. We get pierced penises, and I admit, even as a gender historian, I had no idea that was a thing, so I learned something new. But in between, Marc has introduced important scholarly debates in social history, and that includes some chapters that I just want to spend a few moments at the end here highlighting. He's offering an entire chapter, offering the important revisions about the harem, the history of the harem that were gifted to us by Leslie Pierce. The title of that chapter is her own thesis, Harem Means Home. And a dedicated chapter to same-sex intimacy, or what some might call queer history. He has embedded his own work on the Ottoman Jewish community, featured across several chapters, including the Sultanic Saviors and a Jewish Messiah in the Ottoman Palace chapters, drawn from his first book, the latter drawn from his first book, Honored by the Glory of Islam, on the 17th century Sabbatayshti movement. And finally, I just wanted to offer one really big surprise for me, unexpected, was his extensive use of Palazzo Kaptanian's memoir in his chapter on the Armenian Genocide. This memoir, which not many people use, even in Armenian studies, Kaptanian, in exile from Samsun, who fled to France and penned her own memoir in 1919. That memoir is one of the first memoirs written by an Armenian genocide survivor. It predates Grigoris Balakian's Armenian Golgotha by 3 years. It is likely the first memoir penned by an Armenian woman survivor, and it details the gendered experience of genocide. So I think it's really important that he has done what he so often does, which is give space to the quietest voices in the historical record by including her in his grand history of the Ottomans. So in this sense, the Ottomans, the text of the Ottomans is delivering far more than its title, I would argue. The Khans, Caesars, and Caliphs could perhaps, if we're going to play with alliteration here, be Caliphs, concubines, and queers, because he's actually embedded and done a lot with gender history here, but also with marginal peoples of the Ottoman Empire. So I would like to extend congratulations to Marc on his great achievement in publishing The Ottomans, a book that will surely spark conversations and inspire our field in the years to come.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elyse. Ceyda, please. Ceyda, go ahead. It's your turn.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Well, hello, everyone. And well, Baki, thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be part of this event, having a chance to read talk about Marc's superb book with Elyse and everyone else. Looking forward to the discussion, general discussion too. So those of you who read the book, I think would agree that it is indeed a superb book that takes a set of highly significant questions as its point of departure, questions that are very impressively historical, methodological, political, and ontological at once. At the outset of the book, in the introduction, Marc writes, and he alluded to that specific section as well, so it will be a bit of a repetition, but to quote him, this view of the Ottomans as insiders to European history raises the question of who owns or inherits an empire, who a civilization, who a continent. What do we count or discount as historical continuity? And we might add rupture, of course. Who bears historical responsibility for what? And what happens when both history and responsibility are shared, end quote. What happens, in other words, if we look and move beyond our existing categories of organizing historical knowledge, or beyond our fixed, immovable regional boundaries within which we operate? This is, of course, an issue of our discipline that we have to, or we're obliged to operate as Ottomanist, Europeanist, Americanist, for reasons that Elyse already talked about to a certain extent. Or what happens if we look beyond our rigid religious, nationalist, ethnic categories that are largely products of a relatively very recent past, or the very circumstantial nature of our designations that make up of our histories, such as the infamous one that I like, it comes up in the book, uttered by a certain Tsar Nicholas I, right before the start of the Crimean War, the sick man of Europe. So I do appreciate these questions that Marc raises immensely, not only for their historical value, but also for their methodological, as importantly for their political implications as well. And needless to say, they are especially important and pertinent now in our day, as we continue to grapple more and more with the challenges of political inclusion in Turkey, to put it lightly, in Europe and elsewhere in the world. And in my opinion, this is precisely what makes the Ottomans a great book. It is a trade book written largely for the general public, but maintains its academic rigor all the way, and weaves all these historical and methodological questions in together, and quite effortlessly and organically, I should say, with political concerns and questions. And the result is really an enviably rich foray into public general history. And I mean, that is indeed an immense achievement, I think. And I too would like to congratulate Marc on that. So I have a few questions on the challenges and implications of this weaving process specifically, or process of writing this shared history, and the political implications of its shared responsibilities as well, the hopes that it will get the discussion going. First of these is a minor one, but this came up in Elyse's comments several times about, and it's a curiosity question as well. It's on the book's title. It is an intervention in its own way, bringing the Roman Caesar, the title that the Ottoman sultans did in fact claim, if not used all that frequently, bringing a Caesar together with the Turkic Khan and the Islamic Caliph. So I'm curious about to hear a bit about the process of choosing the title, what aims it sought to achieve. I vaguely remember, maybe completely wrong about that, but I vaguely remember you mentioning it didn't really have much choice about choosing the title at that process. This may, of course, go into the larger question of pleasures and challenges of writing a trade book, and I am curious about that whole process too, so it can tie into a larger question in that sense. The second question or comment rather is a broad one that has to do with the categorical value of the sharedness of the past that the book tackles. Marc lists some of the basic concepts of frameworks, and he also mentioned this in his introduction, that comprises the Renaissance, the Age of Discovery, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, a scientific revolution, as well as sexuality, pleasure, absolutism, limited government, slavery, Orientalism, and World War, and eloquently argues how their meaning would expand if the history of the Ottoman Empire to be considered as integral to the European global history. Here, let me highlight one of these concepts of frameworks, slavery, if I may. not only because it is what I know in general and what I'm most curious about, but also because slavery, the legacies of slavery worldwide, it's kind of make the unequal, unjust world that we live in today. In that sense, we all share that history and we're responsible for it, whether we know it or not. So the question is, what does a shared history of Ottoman slavery or slavery look like? What does the shared responsibility of slavery look like? This is really more of a comment rather than a question, but it would be really interesting to hear more from you and how our understanding of slavery, of any of that concepts would expand through this shared history and responsibility. And last but not least, I will continue with the implications of sharing responsibility, and this time specifically of the Armenian Genocide. What are the political implications and potential dangers, I have to say, of this sharing? I mean specifically the danger of absolving Turkish state and society from the guilt and responsibility of this history. So how do we define Armenian genocide, specify Armenian genocide as part of European history? Claim this shared responsibility, but also make sure, of course, that this does not become a tool to absolve from guilt and responsibility. So, I mean, I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Ceyda. Both of our discussants made very good points, and I think Marc might want to address some of them. What I thought it was that some of our audience members might have to leave at the sort of after an hour. So I want to announce that if you have questions you would like to ask, please raise your hand and I will give the floor to you in the order you raise your hand. Or if you are very shy and you prefer writing on chat, please feel free to do so, and I'll make sure to read the question out loud so that it would be recorded on video, YouTube video. But while you are thinking about your questions, raising your hand, etc., Marc could start with one of the points perhaps that were raised by either Elyse or Ceyda, and then we'll see, we'll monitor raised hands or chat questions. Marc, please go ahead.
Thank you, Baki, and thank you, Elyse, and also Ceyda, for your very well thought and very important questions and comments. And the audience should know that I assembled a group of about 9 colleagues to read an earlier draft of the book, probably 2 drafts before the finished product. So it was quite different than or even 3 drafts before the final version. And Ceyda and Elyse were part of that group. I'm very appreciative of our colleagues from, I found a colleague from each century basically to critique the book. I appreciate that. So perhaps I'll start with Elyse's comments because she was first. And the question is about the impact of the book. And the book is making an impact precisely because I consider this country to be part of Europe. Not everyone, half the people in this country think it's not part of Europe. I think it is. In fact, I'm involved with a group of secondary school teachers who contacted me when they saw the book, and we are developing a unit for the curriculum for different years for history, a unit on the Ottomans, and this will be, we're working on it now. This hopefully within will be accepted and will be taught for the time being, in 250 secondary schools in England. Once we hammered out how to make it concise and how to make it fit into the national curriculum. So this is precisely the kind of thing that, the kind of impact I wanted to have. And this is exactly why I agreed to write this book, because, you know, there's actually a paraphrase, but there's a saying in the Talmud that if you go to your death with your knowledge, it's as if you never even lived at all. or you never even learned that knowledge. And so, I'm not one of those Ottoman historians who doesn't believe in writing the books. I'm someone who thinks that when I've done research, I want to get it out there. And especially now, I'm reaching this point in my career, I would like not only, the 10 people who are interested in that specific topic to read my books, but I would like to have an impact on public debates. And because I'm in England, which is actually a small country compared to the US, and a country which has space for scholars to become public intellectuals, it's a great place to try to make some impact. I was asked to write a biography of Mehmed the Conqueror as part of a Renaissance Live series, for example. So in this country, people are interested, especially because there's an increasing Muslim population in this country, but also because of the colonial past, which is one of the major debates in this country today. And living in the US, of course, there are other debates. There are similar debates, but living in England now, where the government wants to pass a law that will make it a crime punishable by 10 years in jail for toppling a statue. In a country where if you commit rape, you go to jail for 2 or 3 years, right? So the topic of empire, the topic of responsibility, the topic of imperial crimes are topics that scholars in this country and the public are engaged in. So one of the things you point out was about, are people being receptive, and they are. But I do want people to remember that I do live in London, and this is part of why some colleagues have asked, why didn't you write about the Ottomans as an Asian empire? Well, of course it was. And if your interest is integrating Ottoman history more closely to Mughal or Safavid history or what have you, then please write a book on that topic. This was the book that I was interested in writing in. And there are chapters of the book that didn't make it to the book. You mentioned that I have an entire chapter on the Jewish Messiah Shabbatai Tzvi. As a parallel with that, I had a chapter on Sheikh Bedruddin. As one of the themes of the book is Sufism and the precariousness of the dynasty, how in every generation, just about every sultan faced both the blessing and the problem of having these Sufis around him who could either bless him, praise him, give him legitimacy, or could raise an army and try to topple him. So I had an entire chapter on Bedruddin, but they had me take that out. So I was happy that I was able to keep Shabbatai Tzvi in there. And you talk about the sources. One of your many important points was about using this one single Armenian woman's voice to narrate the genocide. And that was a choice of mine. I was debating myself. I was thinking about what I should do, because the rest of the book, I do my best to always use Ottoman sources, Ottoman chronicles, Ottoman poetry, Ottoman archival records, to see the world that the Ottomans envisioned. But when it came to this, I thought it would be more impactful if we hear the voice of the other extreme. So instead of listening to powerful men all the time, if we listen to the voice of one woman that was supposed to be silenced, but it wasn't. And now I could have written the genocide chapter just based on Ottoman sources alone. And because we have the trial records from 1919, we have all the telegrams, we have all the letters, and we have, of course, Talat Pasha's his notebook, his diary that he kept, and that's where I get the figures from. But I decided in that instance to use the voice of a woman. You also, I think it's brilliant in your new title of the book. Of course, Caliphs, concubines, and queers. That's good. But this is what's interesting is that the readers of the book are what helps them see the connections between the Ottomans and other European dynasties is gender and sexuality. So that's working really well. When they compare Ottoman sultanas with royal women in the rest of Europe, including Russia, that's actually a really good tool for expressing that. And also in convincing the readers about the European connection, including the Renaissance, That's how same-sex desire is so helpful. And readers have talked about how absolutely they understand there's this common culture, as the audience knows, in England, in Italy, in the Ottoman Empire, in Iran, of men desiring young boys. And so that helps the readers be convinced of this common, the Renaissance culture, but also the Roman antecedents. So that's what I'll say about your comments. Again, the audience should remember, this is not a textbook. It's not an academic book. It's a trade book. And I was asked, I signed a contract to write a book, a history of the Ottoman dynasty. And that's why it follows the family and it follows the rulers. That's what I signed a contract to do. And as Elyse points out, then from within that, I was able to incorporate social history, gender history, and so on. But that's why there's so many battle scenes. I am not inclined to write battle scenes, but of course, when readers want to learn about an empire, a dynasty, they want to know how they conquered territory. And too many of us don't include all the gore that's really there. This is an uncensored book. It's an explicit book. If you gave this book a rating in the US, it would be, what's it called? 17 and up, non-rated, what have you. But thank you, Elyse, for these really important comments. And then Ceyda asked and said a lot of really meaningful things and point out meaningful aspects of the book, particularly at this political moment. Of course, again, the US, things are happening there. Here in England, different things are happening in Turkey. There's another politics, but this book is geared, well, it's written for a European audience. It's also written for a Turkish audience, and integrating Turkish and let's call it Ottoman and history with the rest of Europe. I hope Europeans and today's Turks see that and agree to it. And what's about the title, what I was coming from that about the title, I was recently at Topkapı Palace, and recently I went there, actually I visited twice as a tourist. And this title actually comes from Ottoman history itself. So Mehmet the Conqueror designed his palace. In the original palace, he designed 3 pleasure pavilions. And we know this, only one survives. One of them was in Byzantine style, which you could say, call it Roman, call it Christian, call it Byzantine. One of these pleasure pavilions was in Turco-Mongol style. And that's the one that survives. Maybe it's Karamanid style. And the other was Islamic. So this idea of Khans, Caliphs, and Caesars comes from Ottoman history. The last thing I'll say is on the topic of responsibility. And I'll just say this, and then I'm happy. I've already spoken far too long. What I find, what's the right word? Satisfying is how on Twitter there are Turkish ambassadors who are tweeting favorable quotes from the book, where I talk about the Ottomans being part of Europe, part of Renaissance Europe, being a key player in the Age of Discovery and so on. There are Turkish diplomats out there tweeting those quotes. At the same time, there are Armenian ambassadors out there who are spreading the word and about that chapter on genocide. So there is certainly there's something in this book for everyone, and it's written about the Ottomans, warts and all. So I'm happy to take questions.
Marc, thank you so much. I really love the sharing of yours, 2 different tweets from Turkish and Armenian. That's wonderful. That's great. There are several questions on chat, and then Victor's hand is up. I'm going to ask Victor whether he'll be around for a little more so that I can read one question from chat. Is that okay, Victor? All right. So I'm going to read one question from chat because 2 separate people kind of asked the same. And so that makes kind of, I guess it's of interest to people. So one person who remained anonymous as a Zoom user wrote, what is European? Is Europe a unifying term for a particular cultural or political or economic or any other norm standard? If yes, what is this norm? And why strive to include the Ottomans into this norm? And then a similar question came from Kübra Kısa, who sent us 3 questions. And the first one I'll read because it is similar. Would you say that the question if the Ottoman Empire is European or not is already old-fashioned within academia? Go ahead if you want to say something on this, Europe, why is it important, etc.
Fair enough. I mean, you know, there are scholars out there who write books who aim to destruct the idea of a clash of civilizations. Now, you could say that the idea of a clash of civilizations has been destroyed in academic works already. But when you speak to people outside of the university, you know, when you speak to journalists, politicians, people who you know, who have a million followers, or people whose writings get hundreds of thousands of people read them. When you talk to people, then you realize that such concepts that Turkey can never join the EU because they're Muslim, these are widespread, and people honestly say these things, just as people will continually talk about it, that there's a clash of civilizations. And so what is important about a book like this is to talk about a Europe which is not only Christian, but also Jewish and Muslim and Christian and everything else. So this is a trade book. This is a popular book. I don't mean it's popular, but I mean it's written for, it's sold here in the major bookstores. So, and people are reading it, and it's having an impact. It's been having an impact also on the right wing in this country, and people are reading it, and they are thinking about it, and they're thinking about Muslims in this country, and they're thinking about their own empire. So absolutely, I think there's nothing wrong with speaking. I spoke to the European Parliament here in London to an audience that was partly skeptical, particularly people from certain parts of Europe that are where the populists and the leaders seem to be more Islamophobic than others. There are skeptics. There are people who believe that one religion is superior, the other is inferior, that one group of people is civilized, the other is not. These are real, and these impact policies, and these impact people's lives in this country. So that's why it's one of the major themes of this book. Again, a colleague who looks east, with Ottomans looking east, could certainly write a book in a different dimension. But would that have a public impact? Writing a book integrating the Ottomans more with South Asian history, it's certainly important. But we have to think of making an impact outside of the university. So this is partly what I would how I would respond to the question. Europe is not a defined thing. Europe is something. It's not a closed category. It's something that people at the time define and decide who is in and who is out, and it changes over time. And so it's not a certain set of standards or what have you. So it's flexible, and that's why I'm trying to insert the Ottomans into it, but at the same time, not out of some inferiority complex, as if the Ottomans or Muslims, cultures and so on are inferior, and trying to say, look, they also built nice buildings, and they also had their portraits made by Bellini. It's not a catching up. It's not doing violence to Arab peoples or anything like that. What it is redefining those elements. If we have to tell people that actually the Enlightenment, there wasn't only a Greek Enlightenment, but one of our colleagues today is writing about an Ottoman Enlightenment, and at the court of Ahmed III in the first 30 years of the 18th century. So it's important for us to think of Europe as going from Baghdad to London. So that's what I'm interested in doing. And colleagues have their different interests, and that's partly what this book is about.
Mark, thank you so much. There are a few more questions in the chat, but I'm gonna let Victor ask his question now. Victor, please go ahead.
Hi. Well, you've already answered my question several times over, in that your book is clearly a book with a mission. It's somewhat engagé, talking about responsibility. Your integrity as a historian holds through to it. The point I wanted to make, and I'm sure if you push the wall, if we have a discussion about this, in the end, you'll admit that the Ottomans were not Europeans. I mean, this is a concept of an idea. In general, the issue is that yes, they may have thought they were Europeans. That's fine. Getting in their heads, that's adding knowledge, understanding. But as an analytical concept, for the sake of analysis, that's not really enough. As historians, we have to look beyond labels, and try what does it mean? We don't use Turks anymore, we use Ottomans, but that's also can be a not very useful term for understanding who these people were. This is all obvious stuff. I wanted to also say that this has not been touched on, but I found the book very, very important and useful as an Ottoman historian, because compared, I don't want to go on the limb, but compared to most books, you display not only grit and interesting things and new angles, but you explain that you've thought about things more than I've seen in most books. Thought things through. We look at Sheikh Bedruddin section there, or comparing Suleiman's self-image with Europe. You've really thought things through. For me, as an Ottoman historian, as a teacher, what you provide is extremely useful. So I really commend you and thank you for that.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you. Mark, should I go and read a few more questions? I think Victor's was more on a commentary and you addressed some of them already. So here, Kübra Kısa had 3 questions. I'm gonna read to you her second and third together. Would you speak of a European Muslim history concerning the Muslim community of the Balkans during the Ottoman Empire? And then a third question is, how important is it to work on manuscripts from the Balkans when we want to talk about a European Muslim history?
Thank you for the question. We're lucky that I just saw I think there are 3 new books out concerning Muslims one is Muslims in Yugoslavia. We can look up the references. One's Muslims in Greece, modern Greece, and one is Muslims in Bulgaria, I believe. So just recently, scholars who know those languages, Serbian or Greek or Bulgarian, and are writing these and some of them know Ottoman as well, are writing these histories. And what they're doing is also what I am doing in this trade book, which is to say, sometimes speaking to people in those countries that actually, Bulgaria has this rich, for example, Bulgaria has this rich past, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, you name it. And so, we can recover that when we open our minds and allow ourselves to think, for example, of Greek Muslims. But it's very hard in these countries to say these things, to get these things known. I mean, how long has it taken Athens to open a mosque, right? It was a decades-long struggle. So all of the work that we do as academics in using manuscripts by, I don't know what you mean by Balkan manuscripts, maybe Ottoman manuscripts, maybe Bulgarian, Greek, what have you. But in fact, I mean, Bulgaria hosts the 2nd greatest amount of Ottoman language material in the world. That's why I always say Turkey, the Ottoman Empire doesn't belong to Turkey. It does, and it doesn't. It also belongs to Bulgaria. Greece, after Bulgaria, has the 3rd most greatest amount of Ottoman language material in the world. So I've been doing research in Greece using Ottoman material. And so I encourage people to do that as well.
Thank you, Mark. There's one more question in the chat, but I'm going to now let Betül Başaran ask her question. Betül, hi. Wonderful.
Hi, Baki. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to see friends and colleagues. This is one of the delights of the pandemic that we can celebrate. Mark, I just wanted to follow up with one of your comments. You mentioned that you spoke to the parliament, which is very exciting and interesting. I wonder if you could say a few things about how your conversations with historians outside of the field of Ottoman studies has been, people who work on global histories, European history and outside of Europe. I'd be interested to hear some. Thank you.
Yes, well, again, it's when we frame our story this way, then it perks people's ears up, and European historians, because they don't read Ottoman or Arabic or Persian or Hebrew or any of the languages that we all, Greek or any language we know, they'll write books, they'll write academic books that take place in the Ottoman Empire, but they might only use British sources, and so they're desperate to learn about what the Ottoman sources are saying about some of the same events. So I think, part of our problem as scholars of Ottoman and Turkish history, we're not all historians, but let's say Ottoman and Turkish studies, is that we speak too much to ourselves. And, how many of us publish articles where, in English, an article in English, where 3 of the words in the sentence are in Turkish? Who's going to be able to read that? How many people publish their works in obscure places? They have a conference and they publish it in an obscure place. Well, who's going to read that? Of course, the 5 people who care the most, but it's going to have 0 impact on the rest of society. So that's why I encourage people to frame their studies differently, because people can't read the languages that we can read, and they don't visit Turkey or these other countries, and so they want to, know what we know. So that's what I'm encouraged by. I think people are very receptive. I think in some ways global history or world history can be a trap, of course, because people won't like to hear this, but it might be the new Middle East studies or the new whatever studies. It's a way for people who are doing, let's say, American history, or in this country, history means British history. People who are doing British history in a British history department say, okay, global history, world history, then they'll put you in a different institute or a different building, and they won't take you seriously as a historian. I'm speaking as a historian. So we also have to, while we make our story into a global story, be it European, Asian, what have you, we also have to avoid the area studies pitfall of being sidelined as well.
Mark, thank you. And I'm going to read another question from the chat. This one is about Venice. I'm going by the order that they were asked. My question is about the relation of Venice and Istanbul, says Levent Konyar. I wonder whether Venice affected Ottomans through developing their vision of being an empire or not. I will appreciate to hear your brief comment.
2 years of Zoom and I still can't get the mute button right. So of course, Venice was oftentimes the gateway to Europe, to the rest of Europe, beyond extra Ottoman Europe. So many of the aspects of that Ottoman society was developing would often pass through Venice. One example that's been written about recently is, of course, coffee. Coffee houses, of course. Venice was one of the first places to adopt Ottoman coffee culture. So briefly, it can be seen as a gateway in both directions, because of course, with the example of Bellini already mentioned, and other goldsmiths and other medallion striking artisans, we also see the Western European influence going east, particularly at the court of Mehmed II.
Thank you again. Now I'm going to read a question that comes from Samir Annuz. He says, thank you for the great lecture. Tolerance was also a pragmatic policy used by the Arab Muslims in Syria and Egypt in the 7th century, right? Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to add to this something that I wanted to ask, and actually hearing you more and more might help me see the answer a little bit already. I was thinking the southern flank of the Ottoman Empire was not as well represented toward the end of the book, especially. And I now can see is that related to a concern with sort of the connections to European history? So for instance, I am thinking of Usama Makdisi's recent book, Age of Coexistence. He's trying to present a different, and he's actually the one who emphasizes the sort of significant difference between the northern parts and the southern parts in terms of living together experience. So because that question connects with this one, I thought I'll add it there to piggyback to it. Please go ahead.
Of course, I disagree with that book you referred to. I mean, what destroyed Ottoman coexistence was the Armenian Genocide. I mean, it was not, later developments in the South. I mean, the genocide was the culmination of this path when the Ottomans moved from tolerance into equality, legal equality, which ended up in genocide. So I would disagree with the argument in that book, in Marc Baer's book. We have to put the genocide central to the end of coexistence. There's no question about it. And dividing between Arab zones and Turkish zones, well, you could interpret this as you like in terms of contemporary concerns. But I would say from a real historical point of view, the Armenian Genocide has to be at the center. And it's disturbing that there's so many modern Middle Eastern history textbooks and books that don't even mention it. So those books that talk about the Arabic speaking zone of the Middle East don't talk about the genocide. And this book that you mentioned also is kind of pushing that away. Fair enough. But the question is, again, this is not, my aim in the book was not to do what Caroline Finkel did so successfully in her book, which was published. I mean, my book is the first book since Caroline's, which was published about 16, 17 years ago. The first book by an Ottoman scholar to write a history of the empire from beginning to end. Now, not a textbook, but a popular book for everyone. So mine is the first one. Now, the difference between, there are many differences. What Caroline sought to do is to write an all-encompassing history of the empire. And she does it. She does it well. So she there's sections in her book on Russia and the Arab provinces, and that's what her aim was. This was not my aim. This was not my aim in the book. Again, I was asked to write a history of the dynasty. And so to write the history of the dynasty, then I focus on those events and those characters that had an impact on the imperial family and on the rulers. And I thought it was important to trace the evolution of governance, which is another of the themes in the book.
Mark, thank you. Thank you so much. If we still have some time until past, if you don't mind answering a few more questions, I'll read one more. This one comes from İpek Demir. Thank you for your work. What is the intervention shift the book achieves with respect to the discipline of history and other disciplines such as sociology? What is the difference this perspective you bring shifts? What is the difference this difference makes in academia and how we research and think? Thank you. This is maybe not, I don't know whether or not you'll be able to say something on this. Let me read one more. Do you agree that the Ottoman sultans used lots of titles, but Caliph was not one of them, except Abdülhamid II, says Vehbi Baysan. Please go ahead.
No, that's not correct. Now, there was a book was published, another trade book before mine, which argued that Selim was the first one to call himself Caliph. But what I find is that Suleiman was the first to call himself. Suleiman I was the first to call himself Caliph. And we know this from the Ottoman sources. It's clear at a certain point in his reign that he took on that title. Not only that, but subsequent sultans also called themselves Caliph, particularly when sultans became less important. They began to, to increase, to augment their religious legitimacy moving into the 18th century. And so it's not true that it wasn't until Abdülhamid that they called themselves Caliph. It also wasn't true that Selim I was the first to call himself Caliph. On the question about what this book is going to do for academia, what have you. So this book shows the way where we can integrate diplomatic history, military history, gender history, history of sexuality, queer history, social history, legal history, and also where we can integrate different types of sources, be they chronicles or poetry or archival records or personal memoirs. So it's feeding them all in there to write a narrative.
Thank you, Mark. Let me ask a question again from Vehbi Baysan. There's a certain effort to link themselves back to Oğuz boyu, thanks to Ebu Suud Efendi, as well as positioning themselves among the European titles. How do you interpret it?
Sorry, I missed the beginning of that.
Oh, I guess Vehbi is asking, how do we interpret the fact that the Ottoman sultans both try to link themselves to the Oghuz, but also position themselves among the European titles? How do you interpret that, he says?
Fair enough. Again, what's interesting for me and important for me is looking at it historically and not starting my book by saying,
Sorry. Hi, Hussam. Sorry, I actually was so stupid because I meant to tell you come at 12:30.
Yorgos, you gotta mute yourself, Yorgos. All right. So what I was saying was what's important for us is to historicize everything and to not start, I didn't start the book by saying the Ottomans descended from the Oghuz, blah, blah, blah. But I don't introduce that concept of the Oghuz and these genealogies until I talk about the 15th century and until I talk about the reign of Bayezid II, who was the first to, like other Renaissance princes, to think about the origins of the family, the genealogy, and to engage in some self-fashioning there by picking amongst the different oral histories and to begin to assemble the first chronicles, the first written chronicles of the dynasty. So for me, that's the interesting question, is noting the time when the Ottomans express that they've entered history and how they entered history.
Thank you, Mark. The first question I read from the Zoom user, she identifies herself, her name, she says, Afsan, not sure why Zoom didn't show it. I still have a problem, she says, with the term European because it's a deliberate colonial construct, a product of the binary narrative of Europe that is good and non-Europe that is bad, which then moved into other binarisms such as civilized and uncivilized, rational and emotional, sophisticated and primitive. I want us to decolonize this harmful narrative that has negatively affected several generations, pushing some nations into superiority complex and others into inferiority complex, she says. But I imagine, I mean, I don't want to say, I don't want to put words to your mouth, but I imagine that's kind of precisely what you're trying to do by integrating the Ottomans into this narrative. Am I wrong, or?
You're right. We can't just get rid of this term Europe, and we can't, you know, it's the question is, what do we fill it with, and what do we include within it? And here I am living in Europe, and I am trying to convince people that Muslims are part of it, and Jews as well. So we can't just explode the concept and just say, well, it's a colonial concept. It's much older than that. But what we try to do in our work, all of us, is to decenter things and to incorporate new elements and to criticize these categories. And that's what I'm trying to do in this book. Again, even when I talk, you know, I have 2 chapters on the Renaissance. But my Renaissance is a different kind of Renaissance. It's not the typical Renaissance that people in this country think about. And I'm trying to get them to expand their minds in the way they think about these categories.
Thank you. And let me also read, these are not quite questions, but for the record of the YouTube, Linda Darling noted, historically, the term Europe became more than a geographical term in the 16th century as a successor to Christendom after the Eastern Christians fell under Islamic rule. And Nabil al-Tikriti noted, I think it might have been Bayezid II who first was called Caliph. And now I swear I'm going to try and find that old primary source citation. Might be, I don't know. I'm not going to comment on that. Are there any other questions from the audience, either on chat or anyone who would like to raise their hand? We are kind of approaching the almost end. If not, I had another question, just if you humor me. I was wondering, how do you position Eastern question in sort of thinking about the demise of the empire and the effect of other sort of ethnic cleansings that happened in the region, such as what happened to Circassians, etc., and how that impacted the last century of the empire? I couldn't quite, I don't know whether or not, maybe you don't find them important enough or significant enough. I was just curious how you position them in the story of the end of the empire.
How I position.
What I'm trying to say is, so
the Eastern question, its impact on the end of the empire, and
right. In the story, the tolerance turns into intolerance.
Right.
That's a very clear narrative line there. But how does that tolerance turn into intolerance? How do we explain that after so many centuries of tolerance? So there must be some different factors playing into this shift from tolerance to intolerance. And I'm wondering whether some of the factors might have to be looked for. Of course, many of them are inside the empire, but I'm wondering whether some of them are also outside the empire.
Well, of course, and there are different regimes in place, beginning with Osman, Orhan, moving into all the way through to Abdul Hamid and so on, the CUP, Talat Pasha. I mean, these are different regimes, different methods of governance, especially from the mid-19th century to the end, different experiments and different ways to organize and gain the population's allegiance. And I think what you're hinting at is you're talking about external affairs. Of course, Russia, the rise of Russia plays a big role in the book and in the story of the Ottomans and the end of the Ottomans. And also, of course, the treatment of Muslims in the Russian Empire and in Southeastern Europe, and the massacres and murders of Muslims in the Russian Empire and in places which are today like Bulgaria, plays a role in hardening of attitudes, of course, especially with the Balkan Wars and with the immigration of hundreds of thousands of traumatized Muslims who had suffered persecution. Of course, this kind of a populace then can be used to turn against the internal Christians, and this is what was done with the boycotts, beginning with the Balkan Wars and then moving towards the genocide. So of course, those external elements have a role. In the book, I look at the different governing regimes and their different approaches, and tolerance, again, is something which is fragile. It's something that's given, but can be taken away at a moment's notice. And that's also something to consider.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marc. I join everyone else in congratulating you for writing a book that will bring the Ottomans into the center of reading public in English-speaking world, getting reviews in widely read papers, etc. Thank you so much for bringing attention to our field and doing it so beautifully. Thank you. And thank you for making time to join us today. Thank you, Elyse. Thank you, Ceyda. I really appreciate all of you making time, and all of our audience members. Thank you. The recording will be on YouTube soon. And what I do is I send the YouTube link to everyone who registered for the meeting so that you can watch it as soon as it is on YouTube. And I already shared the link of our YouTube channel for those of you who could check if they wanted to when it will be up. All right. Have a wonderful day and see you again at another OTSA event, hopefully next month. Bye.
Thank you, Barky. Thank you, everyone.